Hello, this is the amazing story of Jesus in the Old Testament, a video series by me, Kristen Forster, on behalf of Jesus Centered. Now, if you enjoyed this video, it would be really helpful if you could hit the like button and share it with your friends. Then subscribe to our YouTube channel to be kept informed of future releases.
Psalm 78 starts with a statement. I will open my mouth in a parable, and I will gush out ancient puzzles. Now the Gospels actually present Jesus as both the speaker and the fulfillment of these words. But then, of course, Jesus is God's great message. The Word made flesh is both a parable and a puzzle, which, according to this psalm, is how God has always communicated. Now, a parable is more than just a story. The word is related to parabola, which is the arc a stone makes when you throw it. And parabola itself comes from the Greek words bola, for something that gets thrown, say a stone or a ball, and para, which means alongside. So a parabola is quite literally something that is thrown alongside. Now likewise, a parable is a story with an easy to follow narrative arc, but that's got an alongside or parallel meaning that points to something that's a little bit more profound. Of course, Psalm 78 was originally written in Hebrew, not Greek, but the Hebrew word we translate as parable is used in much the same way. That Hebrew word is a mashal, and it's used in the Bible for easy to follow everyday examples, but that illustrate heavenly or eternal things. You get a hint of how Jews understood mashals when Jesus challenges Nicodemus to see the alongside or parabolic meaning of his allusion to being born again. We're talking about stuff we do know, witnessing to things we have seen. I told you earthly examples. How will you believe if I tell you heavenly things? Anyway, back to Psalm 78. Here it states that there's also another way that God speaks, not just in parables, but also in ancient puzzles. Now this time, the Hebrew word is chidah, which comes from a root word, chud, which means to tie a knot. A chidah is a knotty problem that needs to be teased out and untangled. It's an invitation to investigation, a puzzle to be played with to be really understood. Parables and playful puzzles is a really useful filter to understanding and seeing Jesus threaded through every page of the Old Testament. The Old Testament, of course, is made up of history, poems, proverbs and prophecies, but also in puns with double meanings. And so we're going to find Jesus in those overarching stories of the Bible, and we're also going to find him hidden in Hebrew wordplays and encoded message. In fact, this whole video series and the books they're based on is about showing you the stories, the meta-narratives that connect the Old and the New Testament, to unpacking the details hidden in plain sight for those who've got eyes to see and ears to hear. Now Paul, the letter writer, understood the connection between what was written in the Old Testament and the days that he was living through as he wrote the New. So he wrote of the history of the Hebrew Scripture. All of these things happened to them, that's the Israelites, as examples, and they were written down, that's in the Old Testament, for our instruction. Now I'm going to illustrate this quickly by throwing a stone from Genesis, right at the beginning of our Bibles, all the way through to Revelation at the far end. And then after that I'm going to show you an ancient puzzle that's hidden on the very first and last pages of our modern Bibles, but which you're not likely to see in a modern translation. So let's throw that stone. First off, have you ever noticed how the early chapters of Genesis are full of themes and images that are then kind of returned to or even completed by the book of Revelation? So in Genesis 1 it's the heavens and the earth that are being formed, whereas in Revelation 21 it's the new heaven and the new earth that are being formed. In Genesis 1, creation starts with 7 days of divine fiat, that's the word that goes out to make and shape history. Then in Revelation the old order comes to an end with 7 seals, 7 trumpet blasts and 7 peals of thunder. In the creation of Genesis, the phrase "it was good" is used 7 times, whereas in the summation of Revelation, the word woe makes 7 appearances. In Genesis 1, the primeval waters that once covered the whole earth are first divided and then have boundaries put around them. But by Revelation 21, we read that the whole sea has completely gone in the new earth. But before the sea completely disappears in the book of Revelation, first a great beast comes up out of it. Of course, it was back in Genesis that we first read that it was God who had created the great sea creatures. And in a similar vein, the sun and the moon that were first appointed as signs and seasons in the book of Genesis are no longer needed because God's presence has replaced them. In Genesis, a river flows out of Eden, whereas in Revelation, a river flows from the throne of God and the Lamb. In Genesis, there's a garden that contains gold, precious stones, and freshwater pearls, whereas in Revelation, there's a garden city that comes down from heaven. It's made of gold, precious stones, and every gate is a single pearl. In Genesis, Adam receives a bride who's made from his own body after falling asleep, whereas in Revelation, Jesus, who is the second Adam, receives a bride who's made out of his own body after his death and resurrection. In Genesis, man has to hide from the face of God, whereas in Revelation, man has permanent access to the face of God. In Genesis, there's a snake in the garden and it's cursed to wriggle in the dirt, whereas in Revelation, the dragon, who is that serpent of old, is thrown back down onto the earth. In Genesis, a curse is released and death spreads to everybody, whereas in Revelation, death is destroyed and the curse is now being lifted. In Genesis, there's a tree of life, but it's restricted, whereas in Revelation, that single tree of life is now multiplied along the banks of the river. In Genesis 4, God has regard for that first living sacrifice, whereas we get to Revelation and the whole world, thousands upon thousands, are valuing the last sacrifice, the Lamb who was slain. In Genesis, the rainbow is given as a sign of the everlasting covenant of grace. By Revelation, that rainbow is surrounding the throne of judgment. I could go on, but can you see the connection? It's as though the books of Genesis and Revelation are two halves of a whole. They're like a set of fancy bookends, which are clearly different, but part of the same animal. And between them, they hold all of the books of the Bible together to form that big story of salvation. And salvation, of course, is the meaning of that name, Jesus, which of course appears right in the middle of Psalm 78, because Jesus always has been the puzzle or the pun right at the heart of the parable of Israel's story. Now, earlier I said I would show you a puzzle that appears at the beginning and the end of the Bible. Well, Revelation was written by John, the Gospel writer, who starts his Gospel with the very same words as the book of Genesis, in the beginning. But whereas Genesis continues with God, John says, was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, we're going to look at the idea of God the Word in much more detail later on in this series, so here I just wanted to address the puzzle that John is drawing our attention to. You see, in the Hebrew text of the first sentence of Genesis, read by both John and by Jesus, there's a little word sandwiched in between the words God and the heavens, which we don't translate because it plays a purely grammatical role. That word is the Hebrew word at, or et. It's made out of the first and last letters of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph and Tav. It's actually the most common word in the entire Hebrew Bible, but it's never translated, so we don't see it. But John saw it, and he saw something in it too, because the Aleph and the Tav are the A to Z of the Hebrew world. Between them, they stand for the whole alphabet, and therefore everything that ever could be said or expressed. And between them, they also stand for Yahweh and his Redeemer, who are also called the first and the last. Now, when John, the Gospel writer, records for us his vision of the resurrected, ascended and enthroned Jesus in the book of Revelation, 3 times he records that there is an announcement. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last. The 3rd time is in the very last chapter of the whole Bible. It follows that declaration, behold, I come quickly. Now, the primary language for both Jesus and for John would have been Aramaic Hebrew, but John is writing for an increasingly Greek-speaking church, so he reports the statement using the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet, Alpha and Omega, rather than the more Hebrew, Aleph and Tav. Whether he was fully conscious of what he was doing or not, John has concluded the entire Bible with the Greek version of a Hebrew word that appears with God in the Bible's first verse, that was with God in creation, and is hidden right the way through the Old Testament. The Aleph and the Tav, the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, Yahweh and his Redeemer. God's written word has always been a parable that parallels and points to God's living word. It's a story that's full of the hidden word, who was with God and was God from the beginning, and in Jesus became tangible and lived among us. Jesus is the mashal and the chiduth, the parable and the puzzle of Scripture.